We got one submission about an abuse experience and story. From my perspective, I'm not making a stand. I'm just like, this person had this experience and I want people to be able to share their difficult experiences. So we let them publish it. And all of a sudden, we got a ton of responses. Like, it was like a floodgate had opened, and it got to the point where we like had to put a limit on the amount of articles we were publishing about it, because we were just like, this is a creative publication. The other thing was that nobody else was publishing these stories. And it took me time to even understand this. That rabbis read that, this was a popular publication up to that point. So the more this happened, the more I understood how systemic it was. I was now questioning orthodoxy itself, but I was like, became more and more liberal within orthodoxy. I made an argument for why, from a modern Orthodox perspective, gay marriage should be allowed. And that became one of the most controversial things I had said. I lost writers, I lost donors at that point. Like, essentially, this was when the publication was going to end relatively soon.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you'd like to see our faces, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness. We love it when you can interact with the post in any way. All the YouTube-y things, liking, sharing, subscribing, leaving those words of encouragement for our guests who are bravely coming on and sharing their stories. Remember, they are real people who read the comments, so I love to see all of the positive things you guys have to say about them and for them. So today's guest, I found him through his writing. He's actually a writer and activist, and he deals with extremism and anti-Semitism. I'm so excited to bring him on. We haven't had this particular perspective before, which is joining the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community and at 20 years old and then eventually leaving. And he's actually in studio with us today. So thank you so much for joining us, Elad Nehorai.
Thanks for having me.
Did I pronounce your name right?
You did it.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming on and being willing to share. This is a very interesting perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. And for better or for worse, I love these kind of chats. So,
yeah. Okay, great.
Looking forward to it.
I've looked at some of your writings online, and you go deep into the kind of Orthodox communities and exposing things that are going on there. A big part of your story, which we'll get into more in depth at the end, is really understanding and uncovering the systemic problems with abuse within these communities and how it was, I don't know, what would you say, not handled correctly or hidden?
Yeah, I think hidden would be, and also there's, in terms of like a lot of the kind of things you hear about cults and high control groups where there's punishment when you speak out, there's shaming and that kind of thing. I would say, kind of all the things that we tend to associate with anyone who airs dirty laundry, as people say.
Yeah. So let's get into the beginnings of you. Maybe it's best to start with your parents, their background, how they grew up, and then that will kind of inform your childhood.
Sure. Yeah. So my parents are both Israeli. They grew up in a pretty, secular area in Israel, which is very common. When they came to America, my dad was getting his PhD. And I grew up in Connecticut and then in Chicago. And when I grew up in Connecticut, it was very not Jewish, very secular and all that. When we moved to Chicago, it was still secular, but very Jewish. And so I kind of grew up in this environment where, my parents were very, identified as Jewish. They were immigrants, and, I identified as Jewish, but didn't really identify with the religious aspects of it, very similar to them, essentially.
Okay. What denomination or sect of Judaism did you practice? Because I'm a little bit unfamiliar with all the different types, so I want to make sure I understand yours correctly.
So you mean when I joined
with your childhood? Oh,
my childhood. So, really, I think the interesting thing about Judaism and Jewish identity is that you don't have to necessarily be part of a movement. It's more of a tribal thing as well. So I would argue, like, I was, when I say secular, I really mean I wasn't part of any specific movement.
Okay.
I would very much identify with the cultural parts of being Jewish, but not with the religious parts.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say I was like any specific kind of Jew as much as like, a lot of people say cultural Jew.
Okay. Well, that's so interesting then, because then you went to, I would say, the most extreme from being not religious to Hasidic is quite the jump. So maybe, is there anything within your childhood that would inform why when you were 20 you would choose to go that direction?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that question, because I'm like, how does someone go, just like you're asking me, how does someone go from there to there? It wasn't clear to me either for a while. I think one of them, there were a few that were very obvious to me as to why I joined One was that I was very spiritual. And, I think actually besides for like hardcore religiosity, I don't think there's much spirituality in the American world, especially in like more liberal areas. And that's not, knocking them. It's more like just is not as much of a value. And so for someone who's like, why do we exist? And existence itself is weird. And, and what happens after we die? And all these fun questions, which obsessed me at the time. I think I felt weird because I was like, am I the only one asking these questions? It seems very important, to know these things. And also it seemed weird that people responded sometimes like confused as to why even someone would ask these kind of questions, or like, don't worry about it. I was like, I'm very worried about what happens. So, I think that was really hard. And then I think also, one of the things I mentioned was, being the son of immigrants, being brown. Even when I lived in the Jewish area, even maybe more so, I felt like I didn't have a place, and so combined with the desire for spirituality, also being, kind of feeling like an outsider wherever I was really hard for me. I also hadn't been diagnosed with bipolar at that point in my life. So all these different things made me feel very different, and not like I had community in particular. Not even knowing that community was really a thing, it was suburban America, I don't think really values community in the same way that like these kind of groups do. So I think all those things, among others, like contributed to this. All of a sudden and then honestly, when I was in college, I was discovering spirituality, I was connecting to Taoism and different things. And I was so grateful for that and really felt like I'd found something that I had never had before, but I still felt alone. I was like, where are the people that are interested in this in the way that I am, that are, connecting with each other in that way? And I still wasn't really able to find if, individuals would like stuff like, Tao Te Ching and these kind of discussions. But again, like a community was hard to find. And then all of a sudden I go to this place called a Chabad house. It's basically an Orthodox version of a Hillel. Hillel is like a Jewish organization that's on college campuses. Chabad is an interesting Hasidic group because most Hasidic groups, sorry, I'm jumping to this already.
No, sure.
I'm like telling you the whole story. So most Hasidic groups are very insular, which is why people tend to be, unless they've heard of this group, tend to be surprised that someone would become Hasidic. But the truth is this group is very different. They're very into outreach. And for that reason are often associated with being kind of more liberal than other Hasidic groups. But the truth is it's missionary work. Like they're missionaries just like any other missionary. And so, when I was in college, all of a sudden I'd been kind of bugged by this Hasidic rabbi to come to his, it's called a Chabad house because it's very often in their homes and it's meant to feel more communal than a synagogue, And so I went there and ended up having like an incredible time. It was so special. First of all, I found a bunch of other people that were interested in these discussions. What's interesting about the Hasidic community as well is that they're much more into mysticism. They study things related to Kabbalah, like Hasidus Hasidus as opposed to like Hasidic. Hasidus, studies are very connected to mystical teachings. And so, I'd come to this place on a Friday night and they're talking about the oneness of creation and they're talking about, stuff that sounds very similar to the Tao Te Ching, where there's parts of God that or God is a representation of deeper things and all, stuff that I was like, wait, Jews can believe in that? That's so cool. It was really fascinating. And, I still think mysticism is something really special because it connects so many different spiritual communities and spiritual ideas. So being there, then being with other people who are like also as enamored in that kind of spirituality and mysticism, and it was Jewish, like to me, it was like, wow, I've been waiting my whole life for something like this. In many ways I had been. So in that way, if you imagine like for all the liberal beliefs I had, this core part of my identity, number one, this like spiritual searching, and number two, every human's need for community was suddenly fulfilled. And when I frame it like that for myself, it's like almost like, of course I got into it, you know, because nowhere else, no matter how liberal or special or, nice, was like anywhere near that level of depth of belonging,
Yeah, it fulfilled a certain part of your soul that you felt was missing.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of people don't quite understand when it comes to joining high control groups. Most people's like, how could you do that? Or like, hello, it's so obvious. but they really speak to a deeper part of yourself. Usually it's the people who want the best for the world, or it's the people who are searching for answers, and they just are so attractive to give you that answer. Or I think another tricky one, and tell me if this happened to you, is sometimes they point out problems that you didn't realize you had and then say, but I have the answer. And so you're like, oh, I didn't realize that I was sinning in this way. I'm so glad that you showed me the way and you know all the answers. Was that the case at all for you?
Yeah, I think later, once I went to, it's called yeshiva. It's basically like it's a general term for like a Jewish religious learning institution or school. So I went to one specifically for this kind of, now I would say education, now I would say indoctrination. But I was in Jerusalem, and there, I mean, I'm skipping a bunch of steps because I had a near-death experience and all these things.
Wait,
but
we can't skip that.
Yeah.
You're just like, we'll just skip the near-death.
Yeah.
Can we talk about it?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of steps to this story. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go ahead.
So I had a near-death experience.
Yeah.
So I, like I said, I was undiagnosed with bipolar, and I was in college. This was pre this story about joining Chabad, and it was like, I think it was sophomore year, and I was just like a mess that whole year. I'd always been kind of having difficulties with school, despite like doing well in standardized tests and stuff. And then I was home for a summer. I was in college for a summer. I was just like in the area. I was in Arizona in the middle of the summer, very hot. And, I'm kind of on my own. I have a roommate, but he's like traveling a lot. And, I'm smoking a ton of pot and whatever. And I'm feeling, deeply isolated. I also am starting to have kind of like deep spiritual thoughts. And at the time I was like, oh, this is normal. I'm like experiencing spiritual thoughts, but it was like starting to veer into things like, oh, it's interesting. I'm from the middle, my side is from the Middle East and I'm Jewish, and that's very similar to Jesus, That was like first thought. And then that didn't take long to get to like, oh, maybe I am Jesus,
Right.
Yeah, obviously.
Of course.
Right? Just super simple. And, and then it started to evolve into like getting into numbers and getting into this and trying to predict when the next terrorist attack was going to be, and, trying to mind, it was like all this stuff. I could go on and on. I thought the house was bugged, and I was lucky enough that at a certain point people intervened, but before that, I was like, imagine this whole time, this is a manic episode, basically. I found out later, manic and psychotic episode, which was how I got diagnosed with bipolar. So I wasn't eating also, I wasn't drinking. It's the middle of the summer in Arizona, I'm by myself. And, I'm just like, I'm sure, I remember weighing myself after this. I had lost like 20, 30 pounds, and that was after I had like been in the hospital and probably eaten and taken care of myself. So it might've been more. And I remember one day I just like laid down on my bed, and it was like after a long shower, I was like in a very weird place. And I remember, kind of staring at the ceiling, and it started to swirl and swirl and swirl. And all of a sudden, and at that time that also felt normal. But next thing I know, I'm like in this tunnel, that you often hear about with near-death experiences. I was in a tunnel. I was looking up at what looked like, a very white sun and with gray background, and, feeling myself floating and not feeling like I had a body, and, all these, again, very common near-death experience descriptions. And then hearing like, or feeling really a voice saying like, it's not your time. And then feeling like a kick, and then falling back into my body as if, and I remember waking up as if I had like fallen,
Was this before you went into the hospital?
This was what led me to go to the hospital.
Okay.
Well, not that specifically. I mean, that contributed, because I told a friend about this at the time. And I think that was when they were like, oh shit, like there's something wrong, like serious. Because I wasn't talking much. So I don't think people really understood what was going on. And this friend had only come back in town relatively recently. So I don't think they had fully like digested it. And, next thing I know, they're starting to be like, oh, this guy, like he's acting super weird. He just had a near-death, and they intervened. Basically, I had kind of a intervention, they brought me to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist like convinced me to go to a hospital, and I refused because again, I thought they were like part of the FBI and all this stuff. And they had my friends kind of come in and explain to me, like, number one, if you don't do it, they're going to send you anyway. And number two, like, you really need help. And so next thing I know, I'm in the hospital, and luckily I got diagnosed and very quickly actually got better once I had medication. And rest and food.
Yeah.
So those things helped. It was actually a very special experience. But imagine someone, so number one, I'm spiritual my whole life. I have a near-death experience, which I'm like, how do I explain that? You know, this becomes a big part of my identity at the time. At the time, I'm like, as someone who was terrified of death, to suddenly have this like beautiful, like, you know, it was painful, but also beautiful in the sense of like, oh, wow, like I actually was close to it, and I didn't, and there wasn't nothing, you know, and that kind of thing was really powerful. But it was also really painful, really scary. And I remember actually having a conversation with the rabbi when I first started going. And again, like, you know, the way I describe it might sound like some kind of malicious intent, but I do think like people like that, or depending on the person, but I think him and many others tend to have they really believe they're doing the right thing. So when I came to him and I said, you know, I had this experience and I'm really looking to find out why this happened and to find out if there's an answer to it. And he said, yeah, I think I can help you. And I remember at the time being like, that was relatively unequivocal. Like that was a very quick, I was like, I don't think it's that easy to figure it out. But some part of me was like, well, that's pretty awesome also. Like someone knows this, and he's talking about all these deep ideas I identify with in Tao Te Ching. So like maybe he does actually have some kind of answer. And obviously the world is more spiritual than I thought because of this experience. And so all these kind of things contributed to being really taking him seriously in that respect. And
this was the Hasidic rabbi that kind of drew you in with the answers to your questions. Yeah, among other things. Yeah, for sure. It was I would say the community part of it, the mysticism part. You know, we would stay up until like 5 a.m. every Friday night, like talking about all these ideas. Very often I would argue with him about dinosaurs and about the age of the, you know, all these things. Right. And I actually thought it was so powerful because he actually answered me. I mean, I didn't like or agree with the answers. Do you remember what he said about the dinosaurs?
Oh, well, I know the classic answer. So I assume this is what he told me was, and I didn't agree at the time, which, yeah, when I contended with that later was interesting. But I remember basically, I think the argument goes that the world, this was considered the scientific response. The scientific response was, well, the world was created 6,000 years ago, but it was created in a certain state at that point. So yes, there are dinosaur bones, but dinosaurs didn't technically exist. Like, and that's meant to make us question, make us think about, you know, kind of, I don't know if test is the right word, you know, but that's classic. Test your faith. Yeah, whether you believe that exact, you know, and I think very often that is like an evolved response. A lot of people don't, in that community, and others like don't actually need such an answer. It's just like, no, it started 6,000 years ago and I have no interest in, you know, answering that specific question, you know. But I think because, you know, it's really interesting because there's this trope, even in the Jewish non-religious community, that the person, the last Rebbe, like a Rebbe is the kind of unquestioning leader of a Hasidic group. He was in a lineage of 7. He was the last one. And so he went briefly to a university and learned engineering. And so he was very intelligent, and he often would write long letter correspondences to people about their questions because he was, you know, fanatically, and this is saying it lightly, believed in, you know, helping, quote unquote, helping Jews become Orthodox and ideally Hasidic. And it was his father-in-law's idea, who was also the Rebbe, but he was one who really popularized the missionary work that occurred. So he wrote this like long apologia to like multiple, to many, I mean, hundreds of people asking him all these questions because he became known as this sage who could answer scientific questions in this context. I remember when I was kind of on the door, like when I was starting to question this stuff, especially science was actually one of the first things that caused me to question it. I reached out to someone I really respected who was like a scientist and knew all this stuff. And I was like, can you tell me if this is at least a valid response? Maybe not a true response, but do you feel like he's thinking scientifically? And do you feel like there's any from a certain perspective, this could be valid. And he read it and he was like, no, like, this is ridiculous, you know?
It's just flat out, no.
Yeah.
And
because I remember that being such commonly accepted knowledge that it was almost bizarre for me to hear that, because even again, in the non-religious world, there's kind of this aura of love for this man. And I understand the reasons, but like, and kind of respect for his scientific prowess and stuff. And he does write in a way that makes you think is very, very intelligent. It was intelligent, but it was also not scientific, you know?
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting moment for me. But up until that point, that was a huge part of me being able, like, I guess this is a very long answer to your dinosaur question, but it's like, how does one get to that point where you believe that? And that was, there's kind of these steps that get you there.
Yeah, every religion has their apologists and the people that will do mental gymnastics, over Olympic level mental gymnastics to make something make sense. And it's usually the more intelligent ones that can make it make sense or seem to make sense. And so then the other people who are looking up to them, like you said, go, oh, well, he's smart and he knows that it works. So what's wrong with me if I don't believe it?
Yeah, it becomes, I'm sure you've heard the term like thought terminating cliche.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is kind of what his letters became to people and to me, where it's like, I would read some and there was logic to it and I could see but I wasn't a scientist, but I was like, okay, this is I can follow the logic that he's making. And at this point, I'm more bought in and all these things. So at a certain point, you're just like, well, the Rebbe answered that, and so I have less interest in like examining these questions, like
using critical thinking yourself.
Yeah, like every now and then, maybe fortunately, very often, I would have this thought of like, well, what about the flood? Like that doesn't make sense. And then I'd just be like, the Rebbe wrote about something, like don't worry about it. So I think that's like the thought terminating thing is very powerful. And really taught me a lot, because it used to, when I was starting to like question things, I remember it would drive me crazy. I would say something and people would always give me the exact same response. And I would say like, no, here's like the next step to think after that. And they'd be like, it was almost as if I didn't say anything. And I remember at the time being so angry because I thought they were immoral, like that they were bad people and they were just like refusing to answer me. And it took me time to really examine my own, like once you leave, I think it's a little easier in a way to have grace for these people, because you're like, oh, I remember how I would also kind of shut down after certain questions. When I learned about thought terminating cliches, that like transformed how I look at things.
Oh, yeah. In Mormonism, there's one that says, doubt your doubts.
Right.
So don't even consider your doubts. Just put them away. You
Yeah.
don't even need to think about it.
Yeah. I remember when I like, doubts is such a, wow, that's like, I'm sure that's everywhere. The whole questioning whether the validity of doubts, and I remember for so long thinking doubts were like deeply, deeply dangerous, I'm sure you have gone through that.
Yeah. And that's how they keep you in too, because they don't want you to critically think about anything. The second you have a question, critical thinking turns on and they're like, no, turn that off. Don't use that.
You know what's interesting about the Hasidic or the Jewish Orthodox and the Hasidic community, especially like the more high control groups, like what's interesting is like kind of a common trope of Jewish life is that we question a lot and we think a lot and we're smart and all these things. And we're, and it's true. Like when I went to the yeshiva, like you're spending all day with books, like you're spending all day studying and debating. And it's actually very kind of powerful. You're doing one-on-ones. And in many ways, there's kind of like a decentralized form of learning in that sense, which all, when I was first becoming interested in it was like, okay, unlike other groups, like we're intellectual. And the truth is that's something I still hear. It's really interesting. Kind of took me some time to start to understand, we can question within, as long as we come to the same answer.
Yes.
And I found that I was like, oh, right. Okay. That's what's happening, because it's kind of fascinating. Like you're saying about being like the smart people. Like I think we were taught to be smart in a way that led us to dumb conclusions. I'm sounding meaner than I should, but like, I think that's kind of like you have to be very smart to be a smart person, justify believing that dinosaurs didn't exist and that the flood occurred in the way people would describe it,
Yeah, definitely. So we're talking a lot about the mentality. Let's talk about the ways in which you got in and realized it was a high control group, or what were some of the things that you're like, oh, I didn't realize I signed up for this.
Right. So it was, can tell you one that is, when I look back on it, was the one that I should have known was the biggest red flag. When I got engaged, engaged very quickly. When I came back from yeshiva, my wife, who I'm very happily married to, but the story of it to me is an interesting one because it taught me so much in retrospect. When I came back from yeshiva, we started dating very quickly. We knew each other from high school, so that made it a little bit easier. But the way the Hasidic dating world works is like you're dating with the intention of like, am I going to get married? Not just dating, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought it would take longer. In 2 months, we got engaged. 3 months after that, we were married. And so I was very much a beginner at this point. For many, I had just relatively recently decided to eat kosher and put on a kippah. Like we're talking very, very fresh. But I'm going to like a Chabad synagogue at that point. I'm in Chicago, and they're like, you kind of go through this like education process before getting married, just like any Hasidic person. But I also had very little awareness of what I was getting into. And I remember in one of my like study sessions with my partner, who was himself someone who became religious later in life, it's called a Bal Tshuva in the Hasidic world, was learning with me the rules of, I guess I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing, but basically like the rules of having sex. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea that you were supposed to not have sex for for a certain amount of time while the woman has a period, and then after, I didn't know that, this is not actually as common in the like Orthodox world, but in this specific Hasidic group and in a lot of Hasidic groups, they had laws about positions, laws about, or I don't know if law is the right word, but rules, standards. Yeah. Like things that were very important. You were like, this book is, looking back on this, I'm like, wow, I really dived in quick, and that you're supposed to think when you ejaculate, you're supposed to think of a holy man, like when you're doing that. And
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's really, whenever I have a question of like, was this an extreme group? Was this a cult? When I remember that, and I remember, so just that alone, all things being equal, I would argue is pretty restrictive and like it's thought control at like your most vulnerable and your most, most connected to a person.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's this really interesting, anyway, so there was that. And also combined with the fact that I had no one told me this until after I was engaged, until after I was like, and not even right after, it was like, took some time of like having, the wedding invites are out and the announcement has been made. And, and of course I'm now buying into this whole system. So I'm trying to be a good Hasidic, a good Jew and all these things. But, it's shocking to me to look back on that, especially because there were so many people, like I mentioned, who I really believe had good intentions that knew that this was going to happen to me. My rabbi that I mentioned to you, he was the one who guided me through the dating world the dating experience and really encouraged me to get married. Despite even me expressing like, I don't know if I'm ready and all these things. And it was, that's one of the ones that I look back on in that respect. There's a lot, but that was the early one. I think later, that wasn't what caused me to question though.
Yeah.
That's one that caused me to look back after I had questioned.
Yeah, because you were really in mainstream society before you joined.
Right.
And so you knew of the quote world and the worldly ways. Did they make you do any sort of repentance process for kind of being out there and sinning in the way that they would find sinful?
That's a really good question. I actually think I'm trying to think of my exact experience. I don't think there's as much of that there, like more of there's like kind of a confessional experience that happens from that time in yeshiva where you're kind of like, you're around all these guys who are doing the same thing as you. Mm-hmm. And you talk about, I used to, and looking back on it's really fascinating what they're like, talking about, wow, I was in the world like just focused on materialism and I was just wanted to have a good job and I just wanted this. And now, so it's kind of this like shedding process, but I don't think the shaming was more like self-inflicted, I think. It's really interesting when you kind of see these variants and you're like, okay, well, I don't have it as bad as that person, and kind of understanding the nuances of extreme groups is interesting.
So you did participate in some sort of self-shaming or guilting. What was it that you felt that you were ashamed of?
Yeah, I'm trying, I think, I already was doing a great job of shaming myself my whole life, but I think like I think honestly the things I shame myself more for were after, as I became more indoctrinated, and really was shaming myself for any time I had doubts and anytime I like was not observing enough. I always kind of felt like it was my fault, as opposed to like maybe my hesitation was well founded,
Yeah.
and so any hesitancy was like, especially early stage, was like very like I felt very ashamed of. Like I remember once in particular I had this like huge crisis like towards the end of my time at the yeshiva, like where I was like, I don't know if I believe in this stuff, this is crazy, like what am I doing? And I remember just like having gone through all this turmoil and inwardly, and at a certain point I just shut it down and kind of shamed myself into accepting it. And I think like that's this complicated thing, I think, in these stories, because it sounds like, oh, well, it was your choice and all these things, which there's truth to that. And also truth to the fact that you're kind of taught to treat yourself that way.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the hardest things, is just being able to be kind to yourself when you leave these groups. Because first of all, you feel like an idiot. You're like, oh, stupid. Like, why did I do that? But also, you've been put in this cycle of intense guilting and shaming and self-policing. And so it's hard to trust yourself. It's hard to allow your intuition to turn back on. It's hard to just figure out who you are as a human without all of these boundaries.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting, because you kind of were in that world and then you put yourself into the box with all these boundaries and then you were able to get out. I'm wondering if they had any sort of ideas or shaming around your mental health, because I know some groups view it as like demons or you're possessed, even though you already knew you had a diagnosis you were taking medication for.
It's a great question. What's interesting is when I was in Israel, then I came to Chicago, then we got married and moved to Israel again. And then after that, we moved to Brooklyn, which was in Crown Heights, which is like the center of that Hasidic community. And so when I moved there, I was now starting to establish myself more as a writer. That was kind of how I became known as a writer at the time with that community. And I actually, I think because of my experience with bipolar and having recovered, I think I still held on to activist parts of myself and writer parts of myself. And so I thought, from what I had experienced, like I saw that mental health was not being taken seriously enough. And so I actually became kind of an activist for mental health and speaking out about that within the community, outside of the community. And I received some flack. But the other thing that maybe should have been a red flag, but wasn't, because it made me feel good, was that how many people were so grateful that I was speaking up about it. And that I don't think people saw it as like a threat as much as other things later became. It was more of just like kind of a self-help kind of thing. And what's interesting is like, I think actually, depending on which arena you're in the Hasidic world, it's more varied than people realize. It's actually quite varied. So there's kind of like, there can be more liberal wings of it. So, a lot of people were drawn to this discussion, especially people actually who grew up Hasidic and were hearing things about how they could take care of themselves this way. But it was definitely, I wouldn't say without controversy. I definitely got some interesting reactions from people.
Yeah. So you had aspirations to be a writer and you did start writing. From previous interviews, I've heard in some Hasidic communities that the men are not supposed to hold jobs and their main job is to study. Did you get pushback just for wanting to have those goals and aspirations? So
Chabad is interesting because in some ways it is more liberal, actually, in that sense. A lot of the men work, that's like kind of a more other Hasidic groups do that. Chabad doesn't really do that as much, especially because Chabad's perspective is, like I said, it's kind of outward facing. It still holds on to all the same ideology for the most part. It still is like as insular in its beliefs and its practices, but its goal, like the larger goal, is to make every Jew Orthodox or Hasidic and Chabad, really. But they can only do that by being outward facing, by having a little bit more money, by the system of like a woman working and the man being at home is not one that lends itself to missionizing and to going out into the world and to being self-sustaining. So So it's actually like anyone that would be like that is likely the person who becomes, it's called a shliach in that community, but, missionary, essentially. That was kind of the vaunted, like, prestigious job, quote unquote, to have. And the other people, essentially, your job is to have a job and to give money to anyone doing that work and to helping in that work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then let's talk about the topics that you started uncovering and unraveling that really started to help your deconstruction process.
Yeah, so I think the main one at first was science, actually. It started with science, where I just could not let go of these questions. I was just like, I remember being so affected by my questions where I remember this period where I was pushing it down, refusing, but it kept coming up and kept coming up. And I actually got sick. The flu, it felt like the flu. And it was literally from just the amount of stress I was under that, like, my body broke down. And like, I was like, wow, I literally cannot operate unless I am honest with myself about these questions. And so I brought this up to my wife. Because at that time in my life, my wife was much more stable, religiously speaking, than I was, luckily, because she wasn't part of that community, really. She was grew up in a very different way.
Oh, wait, that was allowed for her to not be Hasidic?
Yeah. Well, she became more part of it. She
Okay.
kind of like had agreed to do this with me.
Got it.
In a different way, but she, mentally speaking, she had never like fully bought into it and felt more confident in her own identity than I was. So I was like, the way I saw it was black and white. Like, I either believe in all these things or I leave. And I brought this up to my wife and I was like, I don't know what to do. I think I might leave Orthodoxy. And she was like, well, there's like a variance of ideology around this. You could learn how other Orthodox groups look at science. And I was just like, I can't do that. I was so it was interesting. It was that actually led me to my process of leaving was over a longer period, because I actually became modern Orthodox after that. I started learning about how modern Orthodox people look at science, which is different, while still kind of holding on to Orthodox ideology. And that sustained me for a while, because at first that was all that I needed to address.
Mm-hmm.
And I was still very much in the Hasidic community, but was allowing myself to kind of call myself modern Orthodox. And I would still say the Rebbe was my Rebbe and all these things. I was trying to find this kind of middle ground, I guess, because I still very much was attached to all these teachings. And so then I was also the leader of a creative community. I had also started a publication at that point because my writing had become popular. And a lot of the idea of the writing of this publication was first person narratives, because that was a big part of how my writing had become popular. And so we'd have, the idea was really, I just wanted people to tap into their creativity. As far as I remember, I did not have like a political or activist agenda. My goal was like, creativity shaped my life. Writing has been the most special experience for me. I want other people to have that experience. I know that creativity is not as valued in this community. And I know that when it is, people like shine, because I would do open mics. It was like I did the first open mic that community, as far as I'm aware, had ever had. And it was like this explosion of interest. And I saw like the power of creativity, not just for myself and now for others. And so this publication became part of that. But the interesting thing about creativity, and the interesting thing about first-person narratives especially, is that creativity doesn't happen outside in, right? That's indoctrination. Creativity happens inside out. Mm-hmm. It's the only way it can actually be creative. And at that point, I had learned enough about creativity and had done enough of my own to know this, and to know that, this was just, if I really wanted to be a writer, if I wanted other people to be able to write and to do art, like, I had to teach them that the way you do art is by whatever you're feeling inwardly, you bring out into the world. It might not be perfect. It might not be even right, morally speaking, but speaking about it cannot be morally wrong, because it's all you're doing is just talking about yourself. You're telling a story. Like, how could that possibly be wrong? So I think you can see where I'm going with this.
Like, I bet other people disagree with you.
At that time, I thought, of course, it was so funny. And then, and I thought to myself, like, of course, if I believe fully in this thing, and I also believe in creativity, so of course, someone going inside out, that will have to reflect, religious ideology and my religious ideology. can you see where I'm going with this still? So eventually what happened was a lot of people, we got one submission about an abuse experience and story. And from my perspective, I'm not making a stand. I'm just like, this person had this experience and I want people to be able to share their difficult experiences. So we let them publish it. And all of a sudden, we got a ton of responses. Like it was like a floodgate had opened, and we were just getting like it got to the point where we like had to put a limit on the amount of articles we were publishing about it, because we were just like, this is a creative publication. It's not a publication about abuse. Like we can't become the abuse publication.
So the responses were someone saying, me too, I have an experience
Essentially,
as well.
yeah. And
Okay.
it took me time to really understand like why we were getting so many submissions. Obviously, a lot of people were experiencing abuse. But the other thing was that nobody else was publishing these stories. And it took me time to even understand this. So of course, once someone opens that door for you, and you know that rabbis read that, this was a popular publication up to that point. We had all these awesome writers on it, and it was very much like positive
Respected.
about. Yeah, I mean, it was definitely popular and not considered like a danger and that kind of thing. I'm probably exaggerating a bit in that respect, but relative to what happened, it wasn't. And then, the more this happened, the more I understood how systemic it was. I also started to read about things that were hard to deny as systemic, meaning people being silenced, people being told not to, people being told, this is very common, being told that it will affect their dating opportunities. This was like a very...
So talking about sexual abuse specifically.
Yeah. And so there's this like, kind of embedded system just in general for behaving, which is like, this might lead to you not having a good spouse. Like this might lead to, and it's very, very common one, especially because like of the way the dating world works there, where it's like you kind of have gatekeepers and all this stuff. So being a respected person for getting married was very important, especially if you grew up religious, was even more so. So I was seeing all these different things contributing to it. And I was like, it was unique, I think, because most people don't kind of have that bird's eye view of these dangers and stuff. So I'm now seeing this, I'm now seeing that. And the other thing is that we had to actually launch another publication for anonymous writing for this. So we just could offload it. It was just too much for our publication. And when we did that in particular, but also with my publication, my original publication, we got so much blowback, I particularly, because I was like kind of associated with running it. And there was just like people telling me I needed to shut down the publication, people, writing threats, writing this, writing that, like a ton of pushback around this.
Pushback for what reason? Why were they upset?
I think the phrase I heard the most was like airing dirty laundry, giving ammunition to anti-Semites. But the other thing is there is a concept, this is not something everyone pushes, but there is a concept called a moser, which is like a spy. Basically someone who's like from within telling the secrets, getting the, very often other Hasidic communities, they have this like policy that you can't go to the police. You can only go to like the courts, like the Jewish courts, the Hasidic courts that you're part of. Like if you want to get a divorce, comes up later in my story, but like if you want to get a divorce, yes, you have to get a civil divorce. But if you want to actually get a divorce in the sense of like being able to marry another person, you have to get divorced through a religious court. So someone who goes to the non-Hasidic world, the non-Orthodox world, among some, it's like a massive violation to the point where a moser traditionally is supposed to be murdered or supposed to be killed and as a punishment.
Whoa.
Yeah. So it wasn't, I wouldn't say this was like the most common response, but it was enough that was like, oh, I'm being like, people saying this are essentially threatening me. It was like very obvious and clear in the way they were talking. And it's kind of a way to like cover up to the outside world what they're actually saying.
Yeah.
So that happened. Then it became, as Trump came up, it was right around that time. And I'm seeing what's happening to these victims. I'm seeing what's happening to me and what's happening to people around me. I was starting to lose writers. And, so the Trump became very popular in the Hasidic world. I started speaking up about that. I started receiving blowback for that. And I was starting to feel very, it's the science thing and this and this. And I was just like, it was just piling up. I was part of it. There was another controversy, which is like hard to even explain, where there's a there's a rule for allowing you to carry things on Shabbat, and one community put it up and our community was against it, and I got blowback for defending. It's like that one is a whole other podcast to explain. But like, it was just so many things happening at once, and I was starting to become known as this like activist and this like troublemaker.
A rebel.
Yeah, and I was myself. It was like the more it happened, the more I was like, I don't understand. Like, people are getting angry at me for being against like Islamophobia. They're angry at me for being against racism. They're being angry at me for getting like trying to help abuse victims. And like, I was like, what is happening? Because I'd seen problems, racism and Islamophobia, but just like mental health, I'd expected this like steady, linear progression, because that's kind of what I was seeing when I first joined. I was like, okay, I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that. I heard someone say the N-word, which I'd never heard before, and now I'm hearing it here and here, But like, I'm going to justify this by saying like, all right, they're behind on this, and I'm going to try to help in that respect.
You wanted to make them more progressive.
Yeah, I don't think I tried very hard not to use that word. I tried to be like, we value life. Like, I thought, there were certain values I thought that I shared, because that was kind of when you're becoming indoctrinated, you're starting off, there needs to be a way to on-ramp a liberal and progressive person into a very unprogressive, very non-liberal approach. And so, yes, like, there was a science answers and there was this and that, but like, you also need to address the fact that gay people can't get married, that that a divorce has to happen with the permission of the husband. Like, there's all these things that are like so the opposite of human rights that you need to justify to yourself. So a lot of the missionary rabbis, and it's very common with all missionaries, it like came off as relatively liberal and would encourage you to like help out with these questions, because it's like it seems relatively harmless, and they would say, yes, we have these problems. They would kind of acknowledge it and all these things that kind of make it seem like, so that's part of the indoctrination, is like kind of softening the blow of the very, very opposite of progressive things. And so I'd always kind of felt like, yeah, maybe I have a place and help, I saw it as human rights and stuff, as opposed to, I was very scared of being like liberal and progressive. But once Trump came around, I became happier with the label. So there was this kind of simultaneous thing happening. One, now I'm really questioning everything, because I'm like, wow, these values I thought we shared, we do not share. And this also now was becoming more common in the Orthodox community, where I was like, the Orthodox world itself was enamored with Trump, where I was starting to see this controversy that had been developing about divorces, because this was a very serious issue in our community. Speaking of abuse, a man could refuse to get married to his wife just to punish her. And he could go out and get, if not married, like, enough, you actually could get married very often, not always, but like if the guy was vindictive enough, he could hold out so that he could get what he wants in the civil divorce, and that kind of thing. So, this was, I was now questioning orthodoxy itself, but I was like, became more and more liberal within orthodoxy. I made an argument for why, from a modern Orthodox perspective, gay marriage should be allowed. And that became one of the most controversial things I had said. I lost writers, I lost donors at that point. Like, essentially, this was when the publication was going to end relatively soon, because this was not sustainable. I was going a certain way, and it was not what these writers had signed up for as well. Some of them went along with me in that journey because they had also experienced similar things, and some of them became much more religious during that time. So it's just like we were falling apart. And I'm just looking at all of this. And at a certain point, I was giving up everything for this community I'd grown. There were all these creative Jews. And at this point, because of my voice, I was starting to bring in Jews who were also having a hard time. And it was very special in a way, because we would do events at our home and have people, and we would share stories. And it was like this beautiful experience. And it's still so painful and sad to me that I don't have that community anymore, because it was so special. And I was really like, I have to do everything I can to keep this community alive, to stay Orthodox and all these things. But towards the end, I had been such an activist at that point. I had fully embraced being activist, fully embraced being progressive as much as I could within my framework. And still felt, actually even more so, of course, felt even more ostracized, felt even more like I don't belong. And so at this point, I'm getting so much blowback, so much anger directed at me, more threats, more, getting screamed at on the street and all these things. And I was just traumatized by the end of it. I was broke also. I was beyond broke because there's this idea that like you should be okay with going into debt if like you're contributing to your community and all these things. So I was like utterly broke. There was no way to sustain this community. And my wife and I just like kind of looked at each other one day and we're like, my job, I'd finally given in and got a job like that wasn't Jewish basically. So I ended up going back to doing startup marketing, and I got this job, and it was doing well, and they had tried to get me to move to California, and I was refusing because of this. And finally it was going well enough, and like my wife and I just looked at each other and we were like, all right, like I had really thought I was going to spend the rest of my life there. Really. I really thought like, no matter what, I'm going to stay here. And there was this pile on of like trauma that was happening, and this now questioning everything thing that was happening. And we moved to Long Beach, California. And right at that point, a friend of mine, one of my really good friends, was going through his own divorce. And his wife reached out to me. At this point, I had moved, and even then was trying to still identify as Orthodox. I was like, I have to figure out what kind and what the hell and all these things. But now I have some time to think about it. And then it's like following me, this issue, because his wife calls me and tells me he's refusing to get divorced, like religiously, in order to have leverage in the civil divorce, which is very common and also not even considered necessarily breach of law. So I worked with people around me to this is something that often happens, is like for the people that care enough about this stuff, they'll put pressure on the man to do this, like that enough that if they make it public, they can shame him. There is a system to hold someone like that accountable. What I learned from this experience, because I had always felt, this is, yes, it's a problematic thing, but ultimately like we just have to reform the system, right? That was kind of I was a reformist. And so, but this experience really taught me, I was like, the system itself just kept giving him opportunities to extend any blame he would get. Any like official sanction by the rabbis was almost impossible to get, because he could like change this or that. And this was all officially sanctioned. And it was being run by men who ultimately very clearly were willing to work with him more than they were with her. She just had less power, less of a voice. And it's crazy. It took me this long to see this, but like, there is no way that you can, however you explain it, have a system where a man owns a woman and that can be reformed. Like, that is, not only it can't be reformed, it's, of course, ideologically untenable for someone who is out there talking about gay marriage should be allowed, or this, like you don't believe in racism, you don't believe in misogyny, and you're still trying to justify a reformed system of a man owning a woman. That was when it really hit me, was because I was seeing the real world consequences of someone, the friend I cared about, the woman his wife I cared about. I'd known them. I was so close to both of them at this point, and I'm seeing what they're both going through. And I'm like, this system allowed this to happen and encouraged it to happen. And this woman is suffering. I would argue that the husband was abusive for doing that, but I think he was suffering in the sense that he thought that he could use such a weapon in a way that would make him feel anything but ultimately like power, because at a certain point we actually threatened him that we would go public about it. And that's enough very often to make that difference. And we told him, up to that point, we were threatening, like, in theory. And then we're like, we're going to do it this day. And if you don't do it, this is when it's happening. It took us some time to get there. And it was like midnight the night before. And he was like, all right, I'm going to allow her to get divorced. So at that point, I was just like, okay, now I understand this is wrong. I could not buy into any aspect of this anymore. But now I was also like, what, like you were saying, like, what the fuck, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And now I'm in the middle of nowhere. It's COVID, by the way. I forgot to mention that. It's 2020, the beginning of COVID. And I'm like
across the country, no friends, nothing. My poor wife, was also becoming much more progressive, but was still
proudly Orthodox around so many things. Or I actually should not say Orthodox, because that was part of why she was more stable than me. She refused to label it. But she was observant, observed Shabbat and all these things. And now I'm like, I don't want to observe anything because I don't even know any of these things. I think it's all BS. I don't know what to do about it. So that combined with the trauma, I like literally wanted nothing to do with anything Jewish, nothing, whatever. I even tried once to go to a synagogue, and I picked up the prayer book and had a anxiety attack. Like I literally couldn't hold it. I had to put it down and just like zone out to get through it, So I literally could not, in my mind, observe in that respect. I had a day where I, like, this was such a big moment for me, where we Orthodox Jews eat kosher, and I was just like, I'd been passing Wendy's every day, like on my way to work, and I was like, Wendy's. I remember Wendy's and $1 chicken nuggets. Like I remember liking that. And so one day it took me months, but I like ordered, drive-through chicken nuggets. By the way, not good. I realized they were not the way I'd remembered them, but it was like a big moment for me.
It's a symbolic thing.
Yeah. I was just like, okay, not all non-kosher food is good. I improved the quality after that, but it was like, it was symbolic. And it was so fascinating to me. It was the most spiritual experience I'd had in a long time. Whoa. Because up until that, I was feeling dead spiritually. I couldn't think about God. For a person who was obsessed with spirituality, I could not believe how being religious had left me not being interested in God. Right. I was shocked. Meaning not God like the word. I mean, like, not even the person on high, whatever. Like the feeling of like, I'm connected to something larger than myself. All I felt was like alone, completely alone.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden I have my first time feeling not alone and feeling like the world is maybe not just this like, lonely, empty place, emotionally speaking. It was when I had a chicken nugget from Wendy's.
Hold on. Let's unpack that for a second. So what do you think was happening in that moment when you had this fast food? Because, people talk about, I don't need church to feel God. I can go to a mountaintop. But you went to Wendy's. So what is it? Was it just the releasing of the dogma? Was it stepping out and making a choice for yourself, going against the grain but not caring? What was that, the culmination that created that experience for you?
That's such a good question. I mean, the truth is, the Jewish, remember how I was saying like the whole like learning a lot in the Jewish community? A big part of that is, among other reasons, is that Judaism is very legalistic, especially like the more Orthodox, for lack of a better word, you become, the more there are like rules and laws. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like you're studying. A lot of Orthodox Jews, modern Orthodox Jews become lawyers because they've spent their whole life like learning Jewish law. And so, up to that point, essentially what had happened was I had held on to all the laws, or I tried to hold on to a lot of the laws. I tried to like be living as what I had in my head convinced myself was Jewish, but through all the trauma and all the pain and all the difficulties and all the questions, I had let go more and more of like the soul of it. So that all that was left was this shell, of observance. And so that step was like the first time where I was like, I let go of the shell. And letting go of the shell suddenly gave me the opportunity, like in a moment, to like remember that there was a much deeper reason that I ever cared about spirituality in the first place, And it reminded me that spirituality was not about the shell I had put it in. It was about the soul within me, So similar to like the creativity thing, where it was about what was happening within going out as opposed to what was going out in.
Yeah.
So, looking back on it, I actually almost am like, of course, eating Wendy's. Besides the like high level of Wendy's, it was also like, it was the biggest moment that broke me out of like, I feel like a spiritual prison I was in, and people always like, it's hard for people to understand how I would argue very often the idea of a strict religion, unfortunately, tends to be associated with spirituality when it's the exact opposite. Like you are being taught to like put your soul in a box and not let it out. And now looking back, I'm amazed that I thought that was spiritual. And I'm so grateful that since I left, I've been able to kind of go inside out again.
It's interesting. I mean, first of all, I didn't comment because you were on a roll and I didn't want to stop you, but you were making insane waves in that community. I bet you changed so many people's lives. Honestly, waking people up to what's going on, opening their eyes, allowing them to see what was going on, platforming people in such a way that gave them a voice. It's just incredible that you were able to do that. Unfortunately, it was hell for you, but but I just wanted to say that's so amazing that you were willing to put yourself out there for these people who were coming forward and sharing. So you really did a full circle moment, because the whole reason that you joined was because you were looking for this spirituality. You had this intense burning in your bosom that you wanted to find answers to. And then you come back to the realization that it's in you all along. Mm-hmm. So where did you actually land with your spirituality? Because you had all these questions that you felt were unanswered.
Yeah.
Are they still unanswered and that's okay? Or where are you now with that?
That is a great question. I mean, the truth is that it took me a while. Like, that was one moment, but that was like, there was just, most of the moments at that point were shedding. Like, I had to let go because it was so mixed in at that point. Like the forms of religiosity and the spirituality were so
interconnected.
Yeah. So it was like, I don't know whether I'm letting go of something true or something false. So I need to let go of everything. And that was like a big first step, to the point where I like literally was just, it was actually interesting because it was almost opportune that COVID, it's like, not nice to say, but it was for me, my journey being in a universe where everyone had to like be in a cocoon
and stop.
Yeah. It was like perfect for me, except for the whole, you might die from a pandemic, but it was perfect because I really needed time to be completely separated from everything. And even the move in the end, as painful as it was, now I look back on it and it makes so much sense that I needed that. Mm-hmm. And so I remember reading, when I started getting a bunch of books about leaving. This was how I became more interested in learning the specifics of extremism, the specifics of cults, and all these books, or all these ideas. And so I got a book, I'm trying to remember, Losing the Faith. I think it's a Christian, for people who are Christians leaving. And so first of all, it was fast. I couldn't find a Jewish one that felt like that was any good. So this book was like fascinating because she's a psychologist who had left an extremist Christian group. Mm. She had also come in through a missionary, and she was describing the steps that people go through when they leave. And it was so helpful because I was very scared that I wasn't feeling anything religious. As much as I had that one experience, like I still, like after that, I was like, oh, I still feel nothing. And I still don't want to do anything. So the steps in this book were very interesting because it was the first time I did not feel alone, in the sense that this person wrote that there's always this first stage where you just need complete separation. And that was helpful for a number of reasons. One, I was like, okay, I'm not crazy for feeling completely disconnected. Mm-hmm. And number two, it was like, oh, this is part of a process. There's like steps to leaving. And she described the steps and like, that she's like, you're going to feel angry. At some point, you're going to feel this, like that. And that's a good sign because you're starting to feel again. And you're starting to, because it was like such a bizarre feeling. And so this book was huge for me because it really gave me like an idea of what the process would be like, mm-hmm. and that I wasn't alone. And also that it wasn't just a Jewish thing. It was like, I wasn't like rejecting Judaism, as much as like that becomes this fear, there's like trauma for Jews in that respect. And so leaving all of that behind now made sense to me. And so it was hard. It was very hard. And I could not answer that question for a really long time. And as time passed and I started to like heal and I started to recover, it was really fascinating because being in Long Beach, being alone, being not in like any kind of city or community that I was used to, at first was fine because I was so fine with being alone. And then all of a sudden I felt more and more alone. And ironically, that was like a good sign because I was like, this is weird. Like I've always wanted to be in like, a place like New York or LA. And I always wanted to be active and out there and connect, writing. I had stopped writing completely. Mm. That's how much, for me as a person who defined himself as a writer, it was a huge deal.
Yeah.
And so now starting to write a little bit again on my own. And so these were all spiritual acts, like the feeling of like wanting to connect with community, the feel, and at that point I had learned even more about extremism. I learned more about what leads to extremism. And I had learned that like everyone needs I feel like that people need some spirituality in the sense of believing in that there's something more than you. And everyone needs community. These were, as I mentioned before, two of the big,
the draws.
And now I'm in the middle of nowhere. And so, but these questions were starting to come up for me again. And I was starting to become more interested in spiritual. I started reading the Tao Te Ching again to like kind of go back to my roots, and started doing stuff with my wife on Shabbat and all these things. And that was a big part of what kept me rooted, was that my wife was still observant in that respect and was much healthier. So as time passed, we were able to go more and more to those things in a way that was not pressure filled in the way I was used to.
Mm-hmm.
We went to places that weren't Orthodox, so that was helpful. And we started going to LA because LA had a lot more to offer in that respect. And eventually we moved to LA when we moved to the Jewish community. And what was interesting was I was becoming spiritual, but I was like refusing to define myself a certain way. I felt Jewish. I felt like I believed in something bigger than myself, but it was no longer a thing that I had to fear. It was something almost special, like that I was exploring now. But by the time I came to LA, which was like 2 years after I'd been in Long Beach, I was now ready to like keep exploring. And so, now I've become much more spiritual, but I don't, I think like the common phrase is like non-denominational Jewish. I still see it very much as a tribe. I'm so connected to the tribe. I live a Jewish life. I observe Shabbat in the way that I feel connected to it. So I'll drive and I'll, do certain things on Shabbat. I'm not super strict about it at all, but I like really value that time and really refuse to like, work and refuse to like call people or anything like that. So no matter what, I try to keep that spirit of like a one day that's like this special time for family and community and spirituality and reading, and all these things. And one of the main things actually that when I was first in Long Beach, the only thing that kept me feeling spiritual was going out into nature and going into hikes. That was a thing that was not a threatening association for me. It was just like, wow, like the world is beautiful, And so embracing that was really helpful for me, embracing the fact that how special existence is instead of being scared of existence and death and all these things. So I don't, and I think the beauty is I don't have a hard answer for you. What I have is like, I'm going in and out, in and outwards,
Yeah.
And I think, and I've never felt better, spiritually speaking, which I think is hard for people to understand unless they understand that that's how spirituality actually works.
Yeah, I think it's a really honest answer, and it's one with nuance, and it's one that works for you, and that's why I think it's great, because your answer is not going to work for somebody else.
Right, totally.
And so I think that's such a huge thing when we leave a high control group, is figuring out and cultivating what works for us, because there is no one right answer. It's just whatever resonates with you. I believe that's okay, and if that means dropping the rigidity, dropping certain rules, certain dogma, then please do that, because I feel like your peace and sanity and your the quality of your mental health is more important than specific rules and dogma, because ultimately that tends to trap you in a fear space and not in a space of openness and creativity and full of life. So I think that's a great answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I love how, one of my favorite experiences is speaking to someone who like has gone through the same thing or a similar thing, but in a completely different context, because you really understand like how we've been through something similar. This isn't something that is specific to one place. It's a unhealthy societal toxic dynamic, and then the place we arrive is, like you say, very different. And also it's very similar in the sense of like a shared understanding of what it means to be human, that it's not this like rigid, toxic reality. And so it's so special because I'm like, wow, I share so much with you, and I share so much with so many other people that I speak to about this. And it makes me feel very not alone. It's like we have our own community kind of,
Yeah.
It's very cool.
It's wild how there are so many similarities, but it's not a one size fits all, like you said.
Right.
The conclusion, the ending, whatever it is that brings peace is not the same for everybody. And that's what makes it so beautiful. And that's why we always try to have on new perspectives, because someone may really resonate with you and not our other ultra Orthodox guest and be like, oh, the thing that he said, that's like, ding, light bulb, light bulb goes off.
Yeah.
And I also love seeing in the comments people who say, I'm not even from a religious background, but my family was exactly as you described it. And leaving that family behind is so similar to leaving a high control group. And so that's why it's so important to speak out and talk about it. And now you're doing that within your writing, and you're exposing different things in the extremist groups. Do you want to talk about that at all? What brings you peace and happiness and excitement?
Like I said, it's unfortunate, but that's my joy, is exploring these things. I've always kind of been interested in dark things, but I learned, the more I learned about extremism, the more I learned about cults it's probably not the best word, but, high control groups and all these things, the more like I said, the thing that I found so fascinating was these commonalities. And I was like, wow, I had been spending a really long time, well before being, leaving, paying attention to anti-Semitism and studying it, and especially how it exists online, because I am a marketer. And so, in addition to being a writer, and so have been exploring these communities online and how they work and how they indoctrinate. And so I'm learning all this. I'm learning how indoctrination works. And I'm like, for myself. And then I'm like, wait, that sounds very similar to how like anti-Semitic extremist groups work. Not exactly the same, of course.
Yeah.
But there is like a lot in common, more in common than like you would think of like an anti-Semitic group and like an extremist Jewish group. And yet, the dynamics of toxic control are like not that different. And the indoctrination is not that different. There's just like ways of tapping into people's psychology that work. And so I became kind of obsessed with that. I was so interested in it in a way that also was healing to me. And it was also so healing because I could now focus these questions on something that wasn't about my trauma. I could be like, here's other people's trauma. I can help with that. I don't need to like debate with my own community anymore. It was like a gift in a way to be able to be like, let's talk about the far right and let's talk about neo-Nazis. You might think that's depressing, but for me now I don't have to focus on my own issues, as much. And I can still address them. And so that became like a big motivator for me to keep learning. And I became very outspoken and around extremism. And so I was like, so I became more and more specialized in this form of like education for others, also helping people understand how they can leave, and also explaining how indoctrination happens both offline and online, because I'm convinced that social media, of course, is a huge part of this, and people just don't understand how it works. So that's kind of where I am now in that respect. And, it's interesting because I don't actually talk as much as I used to about my past, which is why I love podcasts like this and interviews like this. But everything I do is informed by that journey, which again, I find special in its own fun, dark way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so great. Thank you for coming on and sharing all of your experiences.
Thanks so much. I feel honored to be here.
Yeah. So we got to do your Linda Listen moment.
All right.
So your sassy statement, as the viral video with Tyler goes, or something inspirational for our viewers.
Am I supposed to look into the camera for this one? Linda Listen, is that how it goes? All right. Linda Listen. Leaving is a very special experience, even if it's hard and even if you're going to go through a lot. The feeling of breaking out is like breaking out of a prison, and leaving a prison is hard at first, but beautiful.
I love it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, where can people find you and support you?
They can follow me on Instagram as Elad, like at Elad Neharai, just my full name. I'm in and out of Twitter a lot, but you can find me on the same handle. Substack, eladneharai.substack.com. And I run a marketing agency called Justice Marketing, which is at justicemarketing.io.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for being here. Do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
No, thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. If you have any comments, please leave them down below. We love seeing those words of encouragement for our guests here today. You can support the podcast even further by liking and subscribing, of course, becoming an advocate for our guests. You can become a patron if you like, patreon.com/cults2consciousness. We have some merch at cults2consciousness.com. Under the merch tab, we would love new suggestions because we need to update all of that. And if you like this video, I'll link 2 more down here below. You're definitely going to want to check out Avi's video or Beatrice's video. We have a lot under this topic. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.